At around 5 a.m., a distress call led investigators to a cramped studio apartment where they discovered a body burned beyond recognition. At first, it appeared to be a case of self-defense in a moment of panic. But as new clues emerged, the incident quickly spiraled beyond a simple accident and pulled the investigation team into a vortex of suspicion. Specifically, in the early morning hours of June 29, 2013, South Korea's Emergency Dispatch Center received a call from a young woman, her voice trembling, reporting that someone was no longer breathing. First responders were immediately dispatched to an address in the Yeonsu district of Incheon. Upon arrival, they found the caller sitting motionless on the bed. As rescue personnel moved deeper into the apartment, the woman silently pointed toward the bathroom. There, they discovered a teenage boy lying unresponsive on the floor. Beside him was an adult man desperately attempting CPR. However, as the responders got closer, they were met with a shocking sight. The victim was completely naked, and his entire body was covered in severe burns. Despite emergency efforts to resuscitate him, the boy was pronounced dead at the scene. The investigation didn't end there. A closer inspection of the body revealed even more disturbing details. The hair on the left side of his head, from the crown to the forehead, had been completely burned off. His facial skin was peeling off in large patches, exposing the raw dermal layer underneath. Large blisters covered his body, indicating he had been exposed to extreme heat prior to death. Meanwhile, the rescue team scanned the rest of the apartment and quickly noticed signs of foul play. Bloodstains were scattered across the floor and surrounding furniture. Most notably, a golf club was found near the window, its shaft still smeared with dried blood, raising immediate doubts that this was merely an accident. Given these suspicious details, police quickly began questioning the two individuals present at the scene. The first was the apartment's tenant and the one who had made the emergency call, a 29-year-old woman named Lee. The other was the deceased, 16-year-old Kwon, identified as a minor. Initial statements shocked the investigators. It turned out that Lee had previously been Kwon's private tutor. The two had been living together in the small apartment in Incheon. However, according to Lee, their arrangement was strictly academic. She claimed she kept Kwon close to monitor his studies and help improve his grades. In her follow-up testimony, Lee claimed the entire incident was an act of self-defense. According to her, Kwon had repeatedly made inappropriate sexual remarks and advances. The situation allegedly escalated around 1 a.m. on June 27th, 2 days before the fatal event, when Kwon attempted to sexually assault her, forcing her to fight back in order to protect herself. Following up on her earlier statement, Ms. Lee admitted to pouring boiling water on Kwon and hitting him with a golf club in an act of self-defense. Shortly afterward, Kwon's condition rapidly deteriorated, and he died. She also handed over a video to the police, claiming it captured the incident and would support her account. However, the footage did not show any sign of coercion from Kwon. On the contrary, Lee's behavior in the video raised suspicions among investigators that she might be trying to manipulate the narrative in her favor. That said, from a psychological standpoint, Lee's claims were not entirely implausible. Kwon, being a teenage boy, might have exhibited inappropriate or overly curious sexual behavior, especially considering his tutor was a young woman. On the other hand, a more critical detail emerged. At the time of his death, Kwon stood 5 feet 7.7 inches tall and weighed nearly 220 pounds. He had a solid, powerful build. Even if Kwon had posed a threat to Ms. Lee, subduing her would not likely have been difficult for someone of his size and strength. What further complicated the investigation was another disturbing inconsistency. A teenage boy living alone in a small apartment with his private tutor was, by any normal standard, deeply inappropriate. This unusual arrangement raised serious questions about the involvement and responsibility of Kwon's parents in monitoring the relationship. In response, Lee explained that Kwon had dropped out of school in December the previous year. He had been preparing for the GED-style equivalency exam for non-high school graduates, and she had promised to tutor him until the test date. That was why they had agreed to live together. As the investigation expanded, Police reviewed Lee's phone records and discovered that she had been in frequent contact with a woman named Kim, a peer of the same age. They learned the two had graduated from the same teacher training college and remained close friends. Crucially, Ms. Kim also had a strong connection to the victim. In April 2012, both Lee and Kim had done a teaching internship at a middle school in Gangneung, where they first met Kwon. Kim was fully aware that Kwon had been living with Lee, so police summoned her for questioning. Recounting the night of the incident, Kim told investigators that around 1 a.m., Lee had called her in a panic, saying that Kwon had tried to rape her. Shocked and unsure how to respond, Kim sent her boyfriend An to the apartment in her place. An was the man later seen in the surveillance footage performing CPR on Kwon in the bathroom. During police questioning, An stated that he had arrived at the apartment at Kim's request. When he got there, Kwon was already badly burned and unconscious. Not knowing what had happened before his arrival, An said he focused solely on first aid and immediately called emergency services. After hearing An's testimony, investigators brought Ms. Lee back in for another round of questioning to clarify inconsistencies in her story. However, she was largely uncooperative, dodging key questions by claiming she couldn't remember or choosing to remain silent. Her evasiveness significantly hampered the investigation. News of Kwon's death was quickly relayed to his family. Upon receiving the call, Kwon's parents were stunned, unable to believe what they were hearing. They broke down in tears and immediately traveled from Gangneung to Incheon. They had known that Kwon was staying in Incheon with Ms. Lee to prepare for the General Educational Development GED test and assumed she would arrange a separate room for him. Entrusting their 16-year-old son's living arrangements and academic supervision to a non-family member was not an easy decision. However, Kwon's parents had reason to trust Ms. Lee. Back when Kwon was in 10th grade, he had met her during her student teaching internship at his school. From that point on, his grades improved significantly. Additionally, Ms. Lee had consistently tutored Kwon outside of regular school hours, helping with lessons and preparing him for exams. Her dedication reassured Kwon's parents and earned their full trust, especially during this crucial exam preparation period. However, things took an unexpected turn in October of that year when Kwon suddenly announced he wanted to quit school, claiming he was being bullied. Despite efforts from both his parents and homeroom teacher to persuade him otherwise, he stood firm. In reality, there was no bullying. Kwon had simply wanted to dedicate all his time to preparing for the GED, as his academic performance had been steadily improving. Ms. Lee took a very proactive role in the matter. She personally visited Kwon's family and promised she would help him pass the GED and continue to support him through college. She even offered to tutor him free of charge, on the condition that he move in with her in Incheon, where she lived and worked, to ensure close supervision of his studies. At first, everything seemed fine. There were no signs of trouble. But about 4 months later, on June 27th, Ms. Lee suddenly called Kwon's parents. In an angry voice, she accused Kwon of trying to assault her, then abruptly hung up. Moments later, Kwon called back, his voice filled with panic. He admitted to looking at his tutor as a woman and begged his father to help calm the situation. That would be the last time his family ever heard his voice. Ironically, Kwon had never had romantic feelings for Ms. Lee. In fact, the person he actually liked was another student teacher, Ms. Kim, who had interned alongside Lee and was the same age. Kwon was so fond of Ms. Kim that he once set her photo as his profile picture on his Messenger app as a subtle expression of affection. His parents were well aware of this. While investigators continued to untangle the complex web between these three individuals, the autopsy results were released. The official cause of death was respiratory failure due to severe burns, accompanied by acute encephalitis and multiple complications. At the time of his death, Kwon's body had suffered extensive injuries across nearly all areas. Even more concerning, the forensic report noted that, in addition to the fresh injuries sustained during the incident, there were older signs of trauma. This led authorities to suspect that Kwon may have been subjected to repeated abuse and prolonged neglect long before the fatal event. Not long after the forensic report was released, police uncovered another critical clue. The video provided by Ms. Lee had been recorded at 11 p.m. on June 26th, while her earlier statement claimed the alleged assault occurred around 1 a.m. the following day. When questioned about this contradiction, Ms. Lee eventually admitted that the rape allegation was entirely fabricated. Her admission paved the way for investigators to broaden their inquiry. Ms. Lee confessed to physically abusing Kwon during the time they lived together. Even more disturbing, she justified her actions by claiming that she had worked hard to help him study, but Kwon had fallen for someone else. According to her testimony, Kwon was often distracted, and she resorted to violence as a way to discipline him. Throughout the investigation, she maintained that she alone was responsible for everything that happened. With her confession, the case was initially closed under the conclusion that Ms. Lee had acted out of jealousy and uncontrollable rage. However, when the case was forwarded to the prosecutor's office, things quickly took a more complicated turn. From the outset, prosecutors were skeptical of Ms. Lee's motives. Upon analyzing her phone data, including deleted texts and call logs, they found evidence suggesting there might be an accomplice still unaccounted for. Expanding the investigation, suspicion soon shifted toward Ms. Kim and her boyfriend, An. Prosecutors seized their phones for forensic analysis, and just as investigators suspected, it was revealed that Kwon and Ms. Kim had once been physically intimate. Extracted messages and data helped clarify the nature of Kwon and Ms. Kim's relationship. During her teaching internship at Kwon's middle school, he had been just 16 years old when he developed a crush on her. During that time, Ms. Lee had diligently helped Kwon with his studies because he was in fact dating her friend Ms. Kim. From Ms. Kim's perspective, however, the relationship was never serious. To her, it was more of a fleeting emotional game than a real connection. She never intended to commit to Kwon and was likely drawn in by the novelty of the situation. When her internship ended and she returned to Incheon to prepare for the National Teacher Certification exam, she began feeling increasingly uneasy. She feared that Kwon, still living in Gangneung and having had an intimate relationship with her, might expose everything. If the truth came out, her entire career as a teacher could be destroyed overnight. At the time, Ms. Kim had already started dating someone new. Kwon had become nothing more than an inconvenient burden she didn't know how to deal with. So she devised a way to cut ties by persuading Kwon to drop out of school under the pretext of improving his grades, and sent him to live with her friend Lee in Incheon. Trusting every word that came from Ms. Kim, the woman he still believed was his girlfriend, Kwon followed her instructions without hesitation. He dropped out of school and moved in with Ms. Lee, beginning an unusual cohabitation under the guise of intense academic tutoring. On the other side, from Ms. Lee's perspective, she suddenly found herself burdened with unexpected responsibility. Although she had taken Kwon in at the request of a friend, sharing a cramped studio apartment with him quickly became a source of frustration. In order to get Kwon to move out sooner, she felt compelled to help him pass the GED, reluctantly continuing to tutor him, even resorting to extreme disciplinary measures. Contrary to her expectations, Kwon arrived in Incheon emotionally withdrawn and unmotivated. What troubled him most, however, was that his girlfriend, Kim, had suddenly stopped contacting him. She wouldn't call, wouldn't meet, wouldn't even reply. The growing sense of abandonment overwhelmed him, making it nearly impossible to focus on his studies. As a result, starting in May, just a few months before the GED exam in August, Kwon's academic performance began to decline. This pushed Ms. Lee to intensify her punishments, both due to the pressure to help him pass and the resentment that her efforts were going to waste. Meanwhile, Ms. Kim was also pressuring Lee to be even more strict. Over time, the dynamic between the two women grew increasingly disturbing, as if they were competing to see who could punish Kwon more severely. On one occasion, when Ms. Lee wondered aloud if she had hit him too hard, Ms. Kim laughed and recalled how she had once beaten him with a belt until he bled, more than what Lee had done. Their treatment of Kwon escalated beyond reason. On June 25th, just 2 days before the fatal incident, text messages between Kim and her boyfriend An revealed that Kwon had already been seriously abused. When Kim asked An to check on him, he replied that Kwon had suffered severe burns from boiling water and couldn't be brought back home. He warned that if anyone found out, they'd both be arrested immediately, and it didn't stop there. The next day, at around 3 p.m., Kwon was reportedly attacked again. The video Ms. Lee later gave to police was recorded at 11 p.m. on June 26th and was accompanied by a series of texts between her and Ms. Kim. In them, Lee claimed that while she was forcing Kwon to memorize study material while standing, he suddenly asked if he could hug her. As she went in for the hug, he allegedly pulled her tighter. This unexpected gesture made Kim suspicious and sarcastic. Perhaps Kwon, emotionally exhausted, had sought comfort from Ms. Lee. But Kim interpreted the situation differently, suggesting something inappropriate was going on between the two. She mocked the situation, saying they might as well become a couple, and told An to go over and see if anything intimate was happening. When An arrived, he pressed his ear to the door and reported that it didn't sound like sex, maybe just kissing. Still unsatisfied, Kim insisted he go inside and record evidence. Following her orders, An barged into the room, filming as he assaulted Kwon, deliberately staging the scene to make it look like a sexual assault had taken place. The situation didn't end there. Every move had been orchestrated in advance by Ms. Kim to help Ms. Lee fabricate a self-defense claim. When An began to tire and wanted to stop, Kim ordered him to continue and instructed Lee to pour more boiling water on Kwon to complete the narrative and make the self-defense claim look real in the eyes of the law. It's hard to comprehend how someone as physically strong as Kwon, who weighed nearly 220 pounds, didn't fight back during such prolonged and brutal abuse. But upon closer examination, the answer lies in emotional manipulation. Ms. Kim exploited the feelings Kwon had for her, using them to control his mind. She made him believe that if he endured enough humiliation and pain, he might one day earn her forgiveness or even her love. That's why, even during moments when Kwon felt lonely and considered returning home, Ms. Kim never encouraged him to calm down or reconnect with his family. Instead, she subtly planted the idea in his head: if you truly love me, pass the GED exam. Then we can live together in Incheon. The more Kwon believed in that imagined future, the deeper he sank into dependency. Despite facing both emotional and physical distress, he kept everything from his parents. Whenever they offered to visit, he made excuses to avoid them, convinced that just a little more effort would make everything better. Trusting Kim completely, he allowed her to manage the rent and all living expenses sent by his family. This gave her total control over his life. Kwon's willingness to suffer for the woman he loved could, to some extent, be understood. But what truly puzzled many was how Ms. Lee, Kim's longtime friend, so obediently followed every irrational command, never once standing up for herself or questioning the situation. To understand this, we must go back to their high school days. That's when the twisted foundation of their relationship began. Lee and Kim attended the same school but were complete opposites. Kim was beautiful, wealthy, and always the center of attention, while Lee was quiet and introverted, often overshadowed by her more glamorous friend. That long-standing sense of inferiority seemed to create a mixture of admiration and envy within Lee. Over time, she began to mimic Kim's choices. When Kim decided to study education and become a teacher, Lee followed, even though she had never shown any real passion for teaching. This dependent personality revealed itself even more in her personal life. In 2009, Lee was introduced to a man named Won through Kim. From the beginning, Lee followed the advice of both Kim and her boyfriend almost religiously. When Won expressed that he preferred curvier women, Lee went so far as to gain nearly 22 pounds just to match his ideal type. Later, this same susceptibility was exposed again. One day, Won messaged Lee saying that if Kwon didn't pass the GED, his mother might be in danger due to a connection with the Yakuza. To any rational person, the claim would sound absurd, but Lee believed it completely. She panicked and became consumed with fear. As a result, she pressured Kwon relentlessly, convinced that his passing the exam was the only way to save her boyfriend's mother. The dysfunction of the entire relationship became even clearer with one disturbing revelation. In 4 years of dating, Lee had never once met Won in person. She believed he lived abroad and couldn't return to Korea, so she waited patiently in hope. But the truth was far more sinister. Won never existed. He was a fictional persona created by Ms. Kim, carefully constructed to manipulate her best friend from the shadows. The shock didn't end there. When police revealed that One was a fictional character fabricated by Ms. Kim to manipulate her best friend, Ms. Lee completely broke down. She panicked, shaking her head in disbelief, unable to accept what she had just been told. Before she could even begin to regain her composure, another name surfaced, An, Kim's real boyfriend, who had been deliberately kept out of the story until that moment. Following these revelations, the case quickly moved to trial. At the initial hearing in December 2013, Ms. Lee was sentenced to 7 years in prison for inflicting bodily harm resulting in death. Ms. Kim received a 2-year sentence for assault and abuse. An, Kim's boyfriend, was sentenced to 8 months in prison for the same charges. Importantly, the court did not classify the case as murder, but rather as bodily injury leading to death. This meant that the defendants were not judged to have had intent to kill, but rather to have caused physical harm that unintentionally resulted in fatal consequences. Furthermore, the court viewed Kim as the manipulative mastermind, and An as someone who acted under her influence. Still, convicting them as accomplices proved difficult due to insufficient evidence directly linking the burns to Kwan's cause of death. Ms. Lee herself also complicated the prosecution's efforts. She willingly admitted that pouring the boiling water had been her own decision, never claiming she had been instructed or coerced. This demonstrated that she still hadn't fully realized she had been skillfully and deliberately manipulated from beginning to end. The case proceeded to appeal. In September 2014, the Supreme Court upheld the original verdicts. When the final sentences were read aloud, Kwan's parents broke down in tears, devastated and unable to accept that those responsible for their son's death received what they considered to be shockingly light punishments. Just a few years earlier, another tragedy had already left a deep scar on the minds of South Koreans. On April 30th, 2012, near the Baramsan Children's Park in Changcheon-dong, close to Sincheon Station in Seoul, a sanitation worker stumbled across a young man who was bleeding profusely. Upon approaching, the worker realized the man was already dead. The victim, believed to be in his early 20s, had been dumped in a patch of grass. His body was covered in wounds and blood, as though he had endured a savage beating. Part of his internal organs had spilled out from his abdominal cavity, a sight so gruesome it left even seasoned investigators shaken. Due to the severe condition of the body, police launched an immediate investigation. Using missing persons reports from friends, they quickly identified the victim as a 20-year-old man with the last name Kim. On the day of the murder, he had been out with friends, but around 7 p.m., he mentioned he had an appointment and left alone for Sincheon. Based on gathered evidence, police soon identified the individuals Kim met that evening: Yoon, 18, Lee, 16, and Hong, 15, all minors. At 8:13 p.m., surveillance footage captured the last known image of Kim walking with this group toward the stairs leading to the subway station. Given these facts, when the mutilated body was discovered, investigators immediately focused their suspicions on the 3 teenagers. The crime scene suggested a murder driven by hatred, and based on verified accounts, Yoon, Lee, and Hong were the last known people to be with Kim, making them prime suspects. To understand the dynamics behind these relationships, we have to start with Park, Kim's girlfriend who was the same age as him. They met on a gaming website in March 2011 and officially began dating in early 2012. During their relationship, Park frequently visited an internet cafe called Commander Cafe, where she was an active participant in its community events. It was there that Park became increasingly involved with a unique group of people who created fictional characters and role-played as personas of their own imagination. Commander Cafe encouraged its members not to interact under their real identities, but to speak and behave as minor characters they had invented. Through this connection, Park introduced the space to those around her, including Kim. The cafe didn't just host role-playing events, it also attracted enthusiasts of occult themes, with characters often based on spirits, witches, or sorcerers. Wanting to support his girlfriend's interests, Kim joined Commander Cafe and began participating in the role-play activities. However, his initial curiosity soon turned into discomfort. Kim became increasingly uneasy as Park grew more and more absorbed in the fantasy world. Although he tried to be supportive, he struggled with how invested she had become. Within the cafe's imaginary universe, Park portrayed a powerful witch, a figure of high status in a world dominated by dark forces. Park's influence extended beyond her relationship with Kim. She recruited others as well, including Lee, a student she had once tutored, and Lee's girlfriend, Hong. Over time, all three became prominent members of the cafe community. Since Commander Cafe catered to such niche interests, the shared experiences drew them closer together. As Park's personality began to shift, Kim's concerns deepened. He wasn't just bothered by her obsession with the cafe or her dark magical persona, he also noticed she was becoming increasingly aggressive and controlling. Empowered by the following she had built inside Commander Cafe, Park started acting arrogantly, often dictating how others should behave. This was especially evident in how she treated anyone who disagreed with her. In reality, whenever she encountered dissent, she would rally her supporters to verbally attack others online, often using crude, abusive language. Seeing this side of her, Kim cautiously suggested that she step away from the cafe. Park's reaction was explosive. She lashed out at Kim, accusing him of being controlling. Their disagreements escalated into intense arguments, eventually leading to their breakup. According to those who knew Park, she had always been someone who resented any intrusion into her personal life. From that point on, Park began spreading rumors about Kim to those around her, including Lee and her girlfriend, Hong, who were still actively involved in the cafe community. After being exposed to Park's negative claims over and over again, both Lee and Hong gradually came to believe that Kim was an untrustworthy and toxic person. Tensions escalated when Kim found out about what was being said and messaged Lee, asking her directly why she was staying silent. But instead of responding, Lee ignored him. Around the same time, Park, Lee, and Hong solidified their alliance and began viewing Kim as a dangerous presence who needed to be cut off. Things took a darker turn on April 24, 2012, when Park published a blog post explicitly expressing her desire for Kim to disappear from her life. Lee commented on the post, appearing to support the sentiment. A few days later, Lee posted cryptic messages on social media, hinting that someone was going to take care of it, implying that Kim would be dealt with. What happened next brought the situation to a breaking point. On April 30th, the day of the murder, Kim reached out to Park, Lee, and Hong, requesting to meet in person. He wanted to apologize for any past outbursts and officially end what he called a toxic relationship. The meetup was quickly arranged. Shortly after, Lee contacted someone to help carry out a plan to kill Kim. The person she reached out to was Yoon, a friend of Hong's whom she had met through online gaming. Yoon had never met Park before and had no connection to Kim. To this day, it remains unclear why Yoon agreed to participate in the plan. Regardless, Lee assigned him a specific role. Yoon, who had a large and imposing build, was to approach Kim first and physically restrain him, giving Lee the opportunity to strike. Lee's role was to stab Kim directly. She also asked Yoon to bring the weapons, including a combat knife and a butterfly knife. The plan was set in motion early that morning. Around 10 hours before the murder, Lee and Yoon arrived at the designated meeting point. At 7 p.m., Kim said goodbye to his friends and told them he had an appointment. He headed towards Sinchon. While on the way, he messaged the group chat, saying he was meeting Park and some people from Commander Cafe. At around 7:30 p.m., near the Sinchon food alley, Kim met with Lee, Yoon, and Hong. The group then walked together toward Baramsan Children's Park. There, Yoon, Lee, and Hong lured Kim into a remote area of the park near Sinchon Station, a place known to be quiet and deserted at night. At 8:13 p.m., Kim sent his final message in the group chat, saying he was walking into a sketchy-looking alley. After that, there were no more messages. By 10 p.m., his friends began to worry, realizing that Kim had gone to meet people from Commander Cafe, but had since vanished without a trace. Once they arrived at the park, everything went exactly as Lee and Yoon had planned. The three, Yoon, Lee, and Kim, walked up a stairway at the park, while Hong said she would wait at the bottom. When only the three of them remained, Kim and Lee started arguing. In reality, the argument was staged to serve as a distraction and give Lee and Yoon the opening they needed to carry out the killing. At the exact moment Kim bent down to retrieve something from his bag, Yoon rushed in from behind and used both arms to strangle him. The ambush was so sudden that Kim had no time to fight back. Immediately after, Lee stepped in and stabbed Kim 10 times without hesitation, killing him on the spot. With little time to think, Yoon and Lee dragged Kim's body into a nearby bush, hoping to conceal it. However, the vegetation was too sparse to hide the body properly. Blood had soaked into the ground, making the scene easily noticeable. In a panic, the two abandoned the body and quickly fled the park. Their following actions only reinforced how careless and short-sighted the group had been. When luring Kim from Sinchon to the children's park, they completely ignored the presence of security cameras, which captured clear footage of all three suspects. Even worse, the crime took place in view of several passers-by. From a psychological perspective, experts later concluded that Lee, Hong, and Yoon were all suffering from severe internet addiction, which deeply impaired their judgment and decision-making abilities. Lee's personal history revealed deep emotional trauma. He had attempted suicide 3 times. During one of these crises, he met Park, who introduced him to Commander Cafe. For Lee, it became a refuge from reality, a place he participated in actively and passionately. His girlfriend Hong also took part in the group's activities. Unlike Lee and Hong, Yoon had no prior connection to Commander Cafe and had never met Park. However, he often posted online about being ready to take on difficult challenges, almost as if he were waiting for one to appear. So when Lee reached out and invited him to be part of the murder plan, Yoon accepted without hesitation. The person who held the most influence over Lee and Hong was none other than Park. To them, Commander Cafe was more than just an online community, it was tied to their inner spiritual world. In that environment, Park stood out as a leader. Her presence dominated, and over time, both Lee and Hong became increasingly dependent on her guidance, following her words without question. With that level of influence, Park easily shaped the opinions of her followers. Despite her frequent use of harsh and offensive language, she maintained strong support. Anyone Park disliked was instantly alienated by the group. In their eyes, Kim was someone trying to push Park out of Commander Cafe and therefore needed to be eliminated. Park had once said she wanted Kim to disappear, which only fueled the hatred. She even posted messages inciting violence, and Lee responded eagerly. Despite knowing that Lee was preparing to act, Park never stepped in to stop him. In fact, just before the murder, Park had been with Yoon, Lee, and Hong. She saw them carrying weapons, but said nothing. Rather than intervene, she chose to stay behind, presumably to maintain plausible deniability in case things went wrong. As a result, the crime scene revealed the body poorly hidden under a few thin branches, along with surveillance footage and multiple pieces of physical evidence left behind. These were more than enough to identify and charge the perpetrators. Yoon and Lee were arrested less than 24 hours after the murder. At the time of his arrest, Lee was casually spending time with his girlfriend Hong at a public bathhouse. Shortly afterward, as the entire case was made public, Park was identified as the mastermind behind the plan, while Hong acted as the lookout. Both were arrested and charged with aiding and abetting murder. In court, Park repeatedly defended herself, claiming she had only spoken out of anger and never imagined her words would lead to an actual homicide. She insisted she was completely innocent. After a thorough trial and careful consideration of all testimonies and evidence, the court issued its final ruling. Park was sentenced to 12 years in prison for her role in orchestrating the crime, even though she didn't carry out the murder herself. However, her sentence was later reduced to 7 years on appeal. The two main perpetrators, Yoon and Lee, each received 20-year prison sentences. Hong was also sentenced to 7 years as an accomplice. This case was not only about physical violence, it was a tragic story of psychological manipulation, toxic dependency, and fantasies nurtured by the online world. A single, seemingly casual comment was enough to push someone toward death. And sometimes, it's not the hand that wields the weapon, but the voice behind the scenes that sets the tragedy in motion. What do you think about this case? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you don't miss future cases.